tonight's lecture is about Reading Abbey at 900, and I was just joking with our speaker, who I will introduce in a moment, that we're now in 901 years because we had to postpone it so much. But I've been assured that Reading Abbey is still 900 years old. Or what is left of it, Tim, isn't it? I think tonight is not just a talk to get an update of an esteemed colleague, and I'm an archaeologist, so I can say that, but also to show a bit about our partnership with Reading Borough Council, how we work together in many different ways. But one of the projects the university has worked with Reading Borough Council is around the Abbey. Now, the university has a long history with the Abbey. We started on Varley Street, well within the precinct of Reading Abbey. And I don't know if you can see from above, but our arms, of course, have the three scallop shells that refer to Reading Abbey. And I think I might be corrected, but I understand that the name of those scallops can be a palmer, which of course you will all understand, and was maybe a joke played on us by those who designed our coat of arms and referred to the family, the Palmer family, who were closely connected to our origin. Now, it's not just the physicality. The university has had a great interest in the Abbey itself. Professor Brian Camp, esteemed historian who recently died, he did extensive archival research and excavations. More recently, we have been working with Reading Museum on the Reading Abbey Revealed project that achieved both the conservation of the Abbey ruins, which I'm sure you will all have seen, and a new public gallery in Reading Museum. And upcoming will be a new collaboration between us, the Department of Archaeology here at the university, Reading Museum, and Berkshire Archaeology, led by Professor Roberta Gilchrist, Matt Williams, and Fiona MacDonald. We will be supervising a PhD student, Lawrence Rees, who will be mapping the archaeological deposits of Reading Abbey, which can then be used again in the future of Reading Abbey, as I think the borough is very keen to develop. And the more we know about the Abbey, the more we can preserve it, and the better we can deal with it as the prison site is being developed. And this project is funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Now, you didn't come here to listen to me, you come here to listen to Tim Tatton-Brown. Tim is a freelance archaeologist and an architectural historian of great repute. He has published very widely on archaeology and architecture of England's most prestigious medieval buildings. Tim is a former chairman of Rescue and has been involved in church archaeology, in advisory and research roles for much of his career. He, for example, held the role as consultant archaeologist for Westminster Abbey, Canterbury Cathedral, Lambeth Palace, and I can mention a few more, but I think I have introduced him enough. And before expectations rise to great, Tim, I'm going to hand over to you for the first face-to-face public lecture since the pandemic. Tim, over to you.
Thank you. Right at the beginning, I would like to dedicate this lecture to Brian Kemp, who should have done it, but alas, he's no longer with us. And also to someone many people will know here, and I hardly knew him, but we corresponded and so on, Cecil Slade, who was head of the archaeology department here, and as we'll see in my talk later on, did sterling but incredibly difficult work in the awful period of the 1960s and early 70s, when rescue archaeology barely existed, particularly in many places, but we'll come to that again. But I have to start by saying here are the four most important books. I hope you can buy them all. I'm not even certain this I got obviously many years ago, the museum published, 1968. It is still, to me, the best short summary of the history of Reading Abbey. But also his magnum opus here, the two great Cartier volumes, and then just published before his death, and I'm honored that Brian sent me a copy when it came out, and I'm going to, in a minute, start and quote from a page in that book. Bran, I should say, I knew pretty well because he did far more than just obviously Reading work. He did an extraordinary amount of work on the bishops of Salisbury's Acta and published vast numbers of their documents, very important documents. So because I live in Salisbury, he used to have a cup of tea with me on his way back from the archives at the cathedral when they threw him out or whatever it was, 4:30 or so, before he got on the train. Luckily, the station's near me, and came back to Reading. And we had a particular interest in early days in medieval monuments. And I'm certainly not going to show pictures of them now, but I can't help mentioning two of the most important, which are in Salisbury Cathedral, not in situ, are two of the key characters involved, in fact, with the beginning of Reading Abbey. But that is a totally different story. But I just mentioned now Bishop Roger and Bishop Jocelyn, whose wonderful, basically coffin lids of Purbeck Marble lie loose in Salisbury Cathedral, amazingly, when they were moved from their original position, unfortunately, in the 18th century. And there are all sorts of arguments about who these were and were they St. Osmond and so on. Brian proved conclusively 50 years ago exactly who they were. A lot of people were umming and ahhing, but he is certainly right, and I think everybody agrees today. So I've learned vast amount from Brian particularly, and so that is my starting point. And let me just see. Yes, the key indented paragraph is in his great work, you see, and it's beautifully footnoted if you want to know exactly where it comes from. But I think everybody can read, thank goodness for a big picture. Peter the Prior and the 7 brethren with him were sent to England by the Abbot Pons of Cluny at the request of Henry, and joined several brethren from the monastery of St. Pancras, began the observance of the Cluniac order of the monastery newly founded by the king, 18th of June. And that is absolutely a key starting point. So I can't resist, because I've been making a detailed study too of this. How many people recognize what that is the ruins of in a Francis Gross early print? Well, here it is. This is where the other monks came to found Reading Abbey from. A famous plan, Harold Breakspear. The whole of the nave there, except for the western tower, is all guesswork, but fragments, which are the heavily coloured area, were, you can see the two parallel lines. That is the new railway line, 1846, which uncovered, amazingly, the chapter house, very similar to the chapter house ruin here, the whole series of really important burials, which, of course, at that time were quite difficult to record, but they were recorded before the railway line bulldozed the lot, including the lead coffins of the, as the label said, of the founders. Anyway, this is not my subject tonight, but it's just to show what you're looking at is, and you can see particularly here how it grew very rapidly as a Cluniac house from a small rear dorter attached to the dormitory to this enormous place with probably well over 100 monks. And so it was this place in England and Cluny, which again is a total lecture in its own right, which was probably the biggest, most important monastery in the early 12th century in Western Europe, are the starting points. I then go sideways because I couldn't resist this. I should have said I've been recasting this lecture quite a bit recently because of the different situation. 2 years ago, I did a different version of the lecture with, rather sadly, Brian Kemp in the audience, the Englefield lecture some of you may have been to. So I thought I've got to do something different. And I know already through the wonderful friends of Reading Abbey, everybody now knows everything about Reading Abbey, having lots of really good talks. So I've got to say something original or different rather than all that you've heard. So I'm going straight to this. Well, I think you can see where this is. This is St. Augustine's Abbey outside the northeast corner of Canterbury. This is, as you can well, perhaps just see a Daniel King engraving of the 17th century of what was there at that time. And it's very similar to Reading Abbey. This is the Royal Palace. The great tower is the 11th century and early 12th century northwest tower of the Abbey Church, which of course is totally gone. It became a quarry immediately after 1538. The two great gates are still there today, but there is much less left of this complex with the great hall and so on. This is the abbot's house, which was kept. Here's the plan, because I did a detailed study of this, gosh, more than 40 years ago. So I'm not going to talk in detail about the plan, but I have to put it on because over here is where the Royal Palace was, in the abbot's lodging. There's the great church with the famous 7th century, or late 6th century, 597 onwards, churches underneath. But also, and that's why it's so appropriate, see the Cellars Garden? This is where Canterbury Prison was built in, here we are, 1808, County Jail and House of Correction. It's still there. It was closed exactly the same time as the jail here, much more famous jail because of Oscar Wilde. I used to be, for 10 years, a member of the Board of Visitors, so I used to go through this wicket door quite regularly a long time ago when I was involved with the board. In fact, the only time I'd been inside Reading Jail in use was when I was a member of the board here. So there are a lot of parallels just from that point of view. And I end by saying this was a rough plan we reconstructed a long time ago again, showing the Royal Palace, which is again broadly very similar what survived here until the middle of the 17th century, amazingly. Oh, in Canterbury, we were lucky to have a nice 1640 plan showing the formal gardens. So the prison, you see, is built on the site of the Cellars Garden, where it had a nice, in 1640 anyway, a nice garden. These buildings, again, I'm not going to talk about the detail, but it's the basic complex. The abbots of St. Augustine's in Canterbury, Dartford Priory, and a few other places, York famously, all had their houses taken off them by Henry VIII very quickly. This even quicker because in 1539, Henry, as everybody I'm sure now knows, was going to marry Anne of Cleves, who they were waiting for to arrive at Dover. And so there are building accounts, unfortunately we don't have them for Reading, for building the Queen's new lodgings from the Great Northwest Tower for Anne of Cleves. And we even know they burnt candles day and night, and they had braziers to get the plaster to dry out quicker. It's all documented, and it's a special lodging. Obviously Henry VIII, you see, could have the abbot's lodging, the king's lodgings, and these rough things are from difficult 19th century excavations, which at least recorded that before it was turned into a famous new missionary college under Beresford Hope in the 1840s, which is what it is today. Now it belongs to King's School, Canterbury. So I've said enough about the background, but you see there are two very close parallels. This plan, which is fairly well known now in the British Library, obviously everybody will know about the defences of 1643 at Reading. Of course, it's upside down, but nobody bothered about putting north at the top. And the main thing to say is it has some clues to things of the past. I will only mention it in passing because it's not really my talk today, but I think there was a castle, as you can see, at the top, which is, of course, southwest, where the Castle Street is now. But that's another story, and you see it was a particularly strong 1643 fortification. But, and I'm afraid this is a blow up with my grotty old iPad at home and turning it round, but this is broadly what it shows of the Reading Abbey precinct. particularly one can see pretty vaguely and crudely the defences of 1643, which in a way, I think I've got a slide showing it in more detail as drawn in the 18th century by Inglefield. But broadly, what it does show, you see, is this is what was left. This I compare with the St. Augustine's plan. The Abbot's Place, alas, now totally obliterated by a place called Abbot's House, which I hate, but I shouldn't be saying that now because it has destroyed everything as far as I can see the underground car park in the early 70s. But to the rest of it, you can see how the cloister, again, partly used at St. Augustine's, the Great Hall almost certainly was the refectory, the one building that there are less ruins left today than there were in the late 17th, 18th century. And this and the Great Garden we know about, and there's details and stables and so on and so forth. So this was a key royal palace. The last list of all the rooms are in the 1650 inventory. So one has to remember, okay, 1539 was the end of the Abbey, but it wasn't until, ironically, Charles I had his head cut off, and of course he followed 1645, I think it was, the local man who was Archbishop of Canterbury, but I won't go down that one today because he's an interesting Archbishop Lord. This is obviously a part of the end of the story. Now, let me then get back to the beginning. This map is what first inspired me to look at Reading, published by Grenville Astor. There we are, 1977, I think his date was. And I played around with it and coloured it up, which is what I like to do, to try and see what's what. And what he said here all those years ago is all very relevant. The reason why I then had to take it out again in the early 1990s, one of the chances really, I was asked out of the blue to be the consultant archaeologist after I'd ceased to run the Canterbury Trust by the property developer for the Oracle development, which, gosh, when I was sent the papers about what was going to happen in the middle of Reading, my heart sank. So I had to do a detailed study. Again, I was helped with comments from Cecil Slade as well as Brian Kemp. And I had to look at, again, it's not part of my story today, that extraordinary area in the middle. Well, I hardly need to tell people here, of course, it is now the Oracle Shopping Centre, but it was more where the mills, the whole complex of mills and the waterways in between. And this was exceptionally well excavated by Oxford Archaeology after very difficult conditions and published by them. So at least something happened in the middle. And I remember even when they found a 13th century cogged wheel from one of the mills, amazing discovery, waterlogged timbers there. But that's not my business today. There are, of course, many maps and wonderful pictures, and I walked around again the museum here this afternoon. I think it's a fantastic museum. It's one of my favourite museums anywhere. And I first came here, Mike Fulford, I know, is here as a Romanist many years ago. Everything in the museum was boring except for the Roman galleries in Silchester. When I first came, I wasn't interested in anything else. About 60 years ago, I think that was. And it contains so many, and it's beautifully displayed again today after the problems they've had with the lovely walk-around one-way system. And there's hundreds of maps, so that's what many people have looked at. I deliberately put this one on just to show what the county jail was like before the present one, which was, of course, first built by the young Gilbert Scott. A lot of people don't realise he designed prisons when he was a young architect before he got onto Westminster Abbey and a few other places. And so you can see the smaller prison there. And this is useful for showing bits of the ruins which were demolished when the Scott jail went up. But otherwise, there are many, there are many plans, so I'm not going to go through them tonight. The one other thing, and I'm afraid it's my crude rough because it's never been drawn up, is the geological map. Oh, and by the way, if you're interested, you can get this map as a free app on your phone. The BGS, the British Geological Survey, has a wonderful facility where you can see the geology of anywhere in the British Isles, except in Northern Ireland, but not obviously the Republic. And you can zoom straight in, and that's all I did, printed it out. I do have a printed copy. And then to me, the key thing in looking at the beginning of Reading is the geological setting, the confluence between the Kennet and the Thames, I hardly need say. And by the way, I also love the Kennet because I used to, many years ago when my children were small, sail along there, or not sail, but motor along there in an 8-berth narrowboat, all the way from Devizes and places like that and up into the Thames. And there's a famous, of course, one-way system in the middle of town with red and green lights, I think, that's unique to Reading. Anyway, that's beside the point. Get to the point. What you have here is an interesting, complicated system of gravel terraces, and ironically, where we are, here we are, University marked down there, that's all heavy London clay at the bottom, and it shows exactly why Reading came into being from a geological, geographical point of view. Again, I can only briefly in passing say that there is a famous reference, I think it's Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, of a bank between the Kennet and the Thames. And I would guess, and this has not been sorted out yet as far as I know, which must have been roughly the west side of the Abbey precinct. It's that key point. That became the Burr, hence the Forbury Gardens in the late Anglo-Saxon period. And somewhere in there, I think, there is an Anglo-Saxon nunnery. That's over to Roberta to sort out now, but most people have said the core is St Mary's Church in the centre of the original town. That is, I think, the centre, but I would suggest that the key Anglo-Saxon site is the Abbey precinct. So the bottom of everything that is in that precinct should at least be late Anglo-Saxon or later Anglo-Saxon. The only other thing I put this on for is that one of the things about Reading Abbey, which it must have had, and we were very lucky to find and excavate it pretty well in toto, is a great Cundit house, which almost certainly, let's do the pointer, is somewhere here, because there are lots of references to a pond, a later Cundit at the top of the hill. So not far, you see, from this famous point where the two main streets come up the hill and come together. And they should be somewhere in here, waiting to be discovered, a really fine 12th century Cundit house. If you want to know what they look like, I didn't dare put it in. We did a total excavation of the one at St Augustine's in Canterbury with a lovely mid-12th century masonry with all the pipes and everything. And then it's a lead pipe all the way down the hill. So that is a key site, and it can only have come from there because obviously it's the high ground and so on and so forth. So somewhere going down there, as at Canterbury, of course, Cathedral is incredibly lucky to have a 12th century plan showing where their lead pipe was. That should exist. So I'm hoping, hopefully not by accident or damaging it, but somebody can run to earth exactly where the Cundit house is, and it will have carried on into the post-medieval period. Otherwise, I think I say little more, but obviously the key thing too, I've just rather scribbled, are the routes and the meeting points and so on, but that is not for today. This is an extremely important map because this is the first edition 1 to 500 Ordnance Survey map, the first really accurate series of maps. And every town in England, ironically, except for London, had a 1 to 500 survey. London, they didn't ever do it. So London's the one place that doesn't have these beautiful maps, and I've used them in Canterbury and many other places. And this is crucial for being accurately surveyed. And so, in fact, all my early work on trying to sort out the monastic setup is based on this. Now it's all out of date because we have digital. And the one thing that has not been done, and could be a wonderful starting point, is to use the new digital map of Reading, the Ordnance Survey map, and replot everything. The buildings shown here are broadly what's here today, you see, already built by this time. But they've unfortunately done things like put dotted lines and said dormitory, which of course cannot be right, as we know it's here. Refectory here, well, that's broadly right, because the south wall, of course, still survives, and even, in fact, that little chunk. But the cloister is completely wrongly shown, as we will see in a minute. The small-scale excavations of Cecil Slade are really important and need accurately plotting on modern digital maps. The other thing to point out while we're here is you see just on the left, and not surveyed, because of course that was secret, is Reading Jail. It's just the outer wall, and the key thing is this northwest turret, which we will see a lot more of a little bit later on, and the gate. And you can see that they have actually dotted on here the ambulatory and where approximately the Lady Chapel, which, as I said, was shown on earlier pre-1840s plans, goes there. So that's useful. The one thing that is not in any way known, but again has a dotted line here, is the nave and the whole of the western part of the great Abbey church. And I still don't know, and there may be other references I haven't run to earth yet, whether any holes were dug here near the great cross for Henry I and so on. But basically we know nothing about, as far as I know, about the nave or whether there were great western towers. There are other documents not properly published. These are the Buckler drawings, which you can see are in the British Library additional manuscript, but very important because it's 1823 to 4. So again, he scribbles this in, and that, you see, was then obliterated by the northwest corner of the prison, that area. And some of these are very useful clues to things also which have disappeared, particularly this evidence, which is, I'm sure, it's certainly disappeared in the present ruin, which shows a sort of bridge at the west end of the chapter house. No sign of it now, but I can say there is an exact parallel to this, or there was at Rochester Cathedral Priory, where you can see the traces much more clearly. It's a way of bridging the west end almost certainly from the great dormitory to go into the church, when you've got this huge, very tall chapter house in the way. But that's a detail which I mustn't get too far into, or I'll never get to the end. And here's another one. There were, I think, 2 or 3 drawings, which I've never seen the originals in the British Library. They need, copying and publishing much more carefully. And I should say the other thing on there you see is Infirmary Ground. This also was then bulldozed by the new 1840s prison. And in fact, ironically, when we get on a little bit later to the keyhole archaeology done secretly in the last few years, but I'll come to that in a minute, it did find part of one of these walls underneath. The consolidation of all this work was done by the famous Dr. Hurry, who again is quite rightly is a hero in Reading for bringing back to life their great abbey. Unfortunately, this plan then went on and on being used for many years. All of that is guesswork. This is all wrong. There are no details of this correct, unfortunately, as we'll see. And so it's a pretty vague plan. Obviously, these are broadly right, but it was a good start. I think this was published just after 1900, and then it was modified, as it says on this, at the Reading adapted for a plan by Dr. Hurry at Reading Public Library. And I think this was then published in the Victoria County History, which again is a useful survey, and for the first time it brings in some of the other key elements. This great garden of 1650 was certainly there by the time of Queen Elizabeth, when we know the acreage, I think, and also incredibly expensive new stables she had built here for specialist horses. The Queen would love that, our present Queen, and they are documented, even if the rest isn't. And a famous mill, which absolutely scandalously, of course, was demolished only about 60 years ago, though with small-scale archaeology, and all that survives is one of the walls where it bridges the Holy Brook. And I should say, by the way, while we have the Holy Brook there, this, I am 100% certain, was dug in the early 12th century with one purpose only, to flush out the rear daughter. I mean, I'm not the first person to say that, but this is all covered up and backfilled, and one day, if there's nothing else to do, careful unpicking of all the huge number of 20th century flints and cement that now cover the rear daughter here, you will find a drain that actually will have bifurcated on either side, because there clearly were two rows of monk seats, exactly the parallel is Westminster Abbey, and so the drain should bifurcate here and come together again and run out somewhere here. And a lot of that may well be intact, even the base of where the seats were. So that alone, and I see it's used for sheds and rubbish at the moment, is a very important thing, as is the Holy Brook itself, because quite a lot of the covering of the Holy Brook is done with post-medieval or post-dissolution material, and some of it has been so bad. I've only once been down there, I think, in my wellies when the water was low, but that, I would guess, if it's followed, and of course it goes for miles west of Reading as an open conduit, but in other parts there may be traces of a barrel vault of the early 12th century and of the walls, and so there's a nice archaeological job for young students to go and do a thorough survey of that, because it must have been created, well, in the, I would say, in the period immediately after 1121, because it's one of the first things you need is to get this going. So there are other things, but I mustn't again take too long, except for this church, which I know was one of Brian's favourite churches. The gate was attached to it, and this is all 19th century, of course, redoing, and there was the famous plaza, I think it was called, in the 17th century here, but under the road there must be the foundations of a great gate, and if that is the inner gate, it should be much bigger than that. As at St. Augustine's Abbey in Canterbury, we have two great gates there which survive amazingly. This should be a very, very substantial, prestigious gate, which I would guess would have been built obviously in the 12th century, but then would have been hugely enlarged. The only parallel, which of course one can see, is at Abingdon, where you have the church and the gate there, as well as here. And I can't resist saying this, of course, is where the University of Reading started as part in the Hospitium building. And of course, it was, one can say the university was only founded in the 20th century, but actually it ultimately goes back to what happened after the dissolution and the beginnings of education and so on. So this university very much, in my view, begins with Reading Abbey. Again, I won't go around too many more details, but you can see very good work was done in the early 20th century. Then we come to the saddest point, but thank goodness for Cecil Slade and the students from here and the museum who did this. Tiny little keyhole trenches, and just reading his report, at least all published, here we are. I've just literally, I haven't got my own copy of this, so I went into the library here first of all and just photographed them with my iPad, I'm afraid, so you're not supposed to be able to read this. But reading this and trying to interpret them is extremely sad. You see, even here, directed by Dr. C.F. Slade, 2 paid workers are available for the first 2 weeks of the 1964 excavations. Absolutely horrendous. There I've seen, of course, they were dealing with what was then the Ministry of Public Building and Works, then DOE, and then, of course, English Heritage. So it's a sad story, but we shouldn't dwell on it. But if he hadn't done this and produced, here's one of his drawings, we wouldn't know anything about what is in this area. All these Roman numeral trenches. I'm glad they're old-fashioned trench digging where you had layers. I never liked the single context system, which is now ubiquitous among all archaeological units, but I like layers in trenches, as were taught to me by Sir Mortimer Wheeler in his great book. Anyway, so these are very important excavations. Again, I'm just going to point out, you see there, the tile floors in part of the cloister. I think this one maybe shows it a bit better. Yeah. And you see beautifully drawn sections. Here are the tiles. I think Lawrence Keane has studied these tiles and will tell you in more detail, but they're, I think, broadly 14th century. Old-fashioned but proper stratigraphic recording. Everything that, you know, was the benchmark in the 60s and 70s, but under impossible conditions. This is the worst plan, not that it's drawn bad, but this is all that the museum and Cecil Slade were able to do. Here, and you'll see this wall again in a minute, that's the main gate of the jail. In Scott's time, as we'll see, there was a corner turret here. In the early 70s, they decided to demolish all of that and the other towers, and of course cut it off to get the ring road better and all of that. The beautiful Gothic turrets, when you look at the early pictures, were all obliterated because, of course, it wasn't secure. And I know all about that, having had to review the walls of Canterbury Prison when I was on the Board of Visitors. So this was a dreadful period in 1971 to 3. You see, they dug holes with the JCB or something, so they record that little detail. Here you see, this was a bit of masonry, destroyed 74 to 5. F1 is the beginning of almost certainly a central curved apse on the east end, and that was found. Anyway, need I say more? But the absolute key excavation is this one. And thanks to Cecil Slade and Brian Kemp, in my view, we know exactly where Henry I was buried, and even his queen, which I rather naughtily scribbled on this, and I haven't even got round to trying making a decent version of it because of this evidence. It's complicated. Here, for example, you see where he was. We found another burial during the ends of the bulldozing here. You see marked on and bits of Lady Chapel. The key thing he didn't recognize, but why should he, and I'll show you a parallel, is that clearly the eastern ends of the north and south aisles of the presbytery were squared off in the 13th century. It's happened in many places. These apsidal chapels, obviously another one here and probably one in the middle, were replaced, and Lady Chapel was first built and then enlarged. We know in 1314 it's documented right across here. So we've got that. This infamous green line is the new prison wall of 1971 to 2, as you saw in the previous slide. So all this was totally destroyed. The old prison wall came down here and came up to this turret built in 1843. I think you can see it's a semi-octagonal, I suppose I would describe it, turret. And there were remains of a bit of floor. We'll see part of it in another slide in a minute. And then it turned there. So you see the north wall of Scott's prison ran along there and turned here. This was just bulldozed, but at least an excavation was allowed. And this is absolutely crucial to our understanding, because I think quite a lot of this was then damaged. Fingers crossed, much of it still survives. Certainly the tiles, I think, are in the museum. having been taken up, and so on and so forth. And as we'll see in a minute, this is the most crucial car park, hardly dare mention the word, because of Leicester and Richard III in a car park. When I came, I probably parked here because this was the prison officer's external car park. So I had to park my car here and walk round to the main gate. And of course, since the abandonment of the prison, it's empty. And I looked over the fence this afternoon. It's all covered in weeds, but you can still see the trench I'm going to show you in a minute. I'll come back to the details of this in a sec, because I will just move on. Yes, here we are. I can't resist saying, here is the famous southeast corner of the presbytery, lovely cast down old men of works type sign. And then you have this fence. There is the infamous 1972-3 new wall of the prison. And if one goes into the corner, yeah, it was rather late in the day when I leaned over the fence and saw, you see the brand new tarmac? I think I took this in 2019. Here's the officers' car park. And here is the southeast corner of all the land that belongs to the Roman Catholic Church. Very important land. Oh yes, and I put this in, this is our working drawing, trying to make a new plan, which Jill did for me and Roberta got some money for. And I'll show the proper plan in a minute at the end. But what we were trying to do, you see, was to plot particularly the cloisters from all the small excavations of settled slate. So you can see how these are the actual cloister walks, unlike all the earlier plans, the Harry plan, and so on. We also, and this is another story which needs a lot of work on its own, looked at where the defences, the Englefield plan is very useful. So you see it chopped right through the nave. Most of the nave, almost certainly the rubble as well as the stone, was quarried out in the 1550s when they rebuilt St Mary's Church, hence why there aren't any ruins. I'm not certain that that's, I think, shown on the Ordnance Survey map, what that comes from, but somebody may be able to tell me that someone did dig down and found something there, but I haven't found the evidence. Basically, we know nothing, and there should be two towers, almost certainly. But the key thing with this is a big ditch here, and all of this was done probably in 1643, when this was the gate, and these were the outer defences, obviously facing Caversham. Nothing in between, no railway, of course, by then, and straight across, lovely pictures across the floodplain. And so this is really interesting archaeology in its own right. The best parallel to this is what was done at Exeter with their 17th century defences, and published by Mark Starley, I think, who wrote a booklet and then much more on this. And you can see from that plan of the defences, it should be possible to work out exactly what was happening here, and possibly under the, of course, this is now the famous amorphous landscape mound in the Forbury Gardens, what is underneath, using just, say, ground penetrating radar or something like that. But anyway, I must go on, but you can see what we were doing here was trying to plot out these trenches, and eventually, this is a saga in its own right, but luckily I was persuaded to write a rather naughty article in Current Archaeology about this. But when I inquired from the Ministry of Justice whether I could read the report on the trial excavations done at Reading Jail, the answer was no. It's secret, it's commercial. And the reason for this is, of course, flog the jail, and this is private knowledge for the developer. My colleague David Harrison, who had been a House of Commons clerk, spent a long time asking questions, freedom of information, and we eventually got the report. So these are the keyholes that were dug here, and found these bits of walls, which he sort of knew about. As you can see, these lines are from the Buckler plan. And these horrible little trenches, oh, by the way, we also found them before we got the report on Google Earth, which was rather nice. You could snoop from above, because they're all in between, obviously, where the buildings are. But the most infamous one is this trench, you see, which runs across this end of the northeast corner of the presbytery. And dare I show it to you, this is from the report. Skelly. This is, I should say, looking south. There's the fence at the bottom of the garden. Here's the prison wall of the 70s. There is the rebuilt 1970s wall to what is the Roman Catholic land, the school and the nursery beyond. And this is looking the other way. And here's even the nice tile floor within the octagonal turret of the northwest corner of Gilbert Scott's prison. So that was all there, and we saw that it was spotted but not looked at in detail by Cecil Slade. Then you have the masonry foundation, 2 masonry foundations here and here. And unfortunately, there's a lot of brick. No drawn sections apparently were made when these excavations were done a couple of years ago. And you can see the quality of archaeology, dare I say it, is not exactly great. It's now backfilled, covered in tarmac, and this whole area's now got lovely weeds growing all over it. This is the absolute crucial area if, oh yes, and these are the drawn records. Oh dear, I should say a little more. There's the Scott, you see, plan. These are the 2 bits of masonry, medieval and prison. Well, I think fairly obvious. And then their overall plan, you see, just has, where they did, I can't remember how many, 20 or so keyhole archaeology trenches, pointless. But this was all paid for by the Ministry of Justice as part of a way of saying, well, we can tell you what, there is a bit of archaeology underneath. You've got to take this into account when you knock the building down or completely rebuild it as your new hotel or whatever. Luckily, I won't go any further because I know that doesn't happen, and I hope one day it will belong to the city. But I shouldn't probably even say that now. But here you can see all they did, there's the infamous trench, is plotted in relation to the Ordnance Survey map. They hadn't obviously even looked at Cecil Slade's report in the Berkshire Journal. So it's a sad story, but this is a very low point. And yes, just getting back, and I know I should be checking my watch that I'm not going on too long, to this horrible scribbled plan. This is the nub of what I want to end with, is by looking at what was recorded at the time. You see, obviously it was well recorded considering the difficulties, but CB are column bases, and I'm sure it's right, but it's robbed out right down to below any masonry, but just round the corner here, there is the famous base. So yes, here. So there's a lot one can do with this. Here is what he recorded of the corner turret, you see, which the 2018 trench just went across here and found nice tiled floor inside. I think this was still covered in concrete or not available. And Cecil Slade said area of high altar destroyed. I don't think that is actually correct. A lot of it was by the foundations, but the high altar, obviously, of the original building must have been on the cord of the apse here. There are other things, for example, like step. I would suggest these are probably the bases of tomb structures. And I'll say more than, no more than say there's one big step in inverted commas here. And you can see I've asked the rather naughty question. It's right by there. I'll come to the documentary evidence in a minute. This wall here, the boundary wall to the Roman Catholic area, was rebuilt after the excavation, unfortunately, so there may have been a deeper foundation, but I would suggest that somewhere in here, and not in the car park, dare one say, should be the site of the tomb of King Henry I. And we know, as we'll see in the documentary evidence that Brian found, that this is quite likely to be, even though it's robbed down to the masonry foundation with just mortar marks, the site of the Queen's tomb. I think I won't say anything more about it, but there are other things one could talk about, particularly in relation to the tile bands which were well recorded, and they could all be reconstructed. Amazingly, one day, if this is excavated, one could even sort of put back, as with a Roman mosaic, that bit of tile paving, I think, with what is in the museum. And there are other odds and ends here. And also, there will probably be more of the southeast aisle here, but of course, it's got the prison wall on at the moment, so that's a bit difficult. So this is then the other crucial thing that Brian published in his new miscellany. This document, which you found in Lambeth Palace Library, you see, manuscript 371. Should I read out? Basically, the key thing is William, Earl of Lincoln, married Queen Adelitza, wife of our founder, is evident in a charter of confirmation of the same William. Accordingly, the King's Council would not permit her to lie with him in the middle of the presbytery before the altar. She lies buried, however, on the north side of the choir between two columns. That's pretty clear. And if it's directly north, well, we should know exactly which fragment, if it's left, is there. Apart from Henry I, our founder, and her husband, on whose souls may God have mercy, amen. So that's an absolutely crucial document. The only thing I can add to this, which Brian certainly knew about, was Adrian Iles, who told me, because I did another lecture, and he kindly said, oh, I think I've got something that Brian doesn't know that I have found in Trinity College, Dublin. So this is the famous record you see in the Visitations of Berkshire, 1532, the first one, which of course is before the dissolution, and it's a bit gobbledygook. You know, the first line's okay, and then he jumps straight to other people, which don't concern us today. What Adrian found in Trinity College, Dublin, there is another version by the York Herald, obviously based on the same original document, which has on the right hand of him lieth buried Queen Adelitza, his second wife. There it is. So that line has somehow got missed out from this. So here it's as straightforward as anything you see, that as we've already seen, in the midst of the high choir, within, etc. And then these are other people who were buried, well, in the surrounding area, particularly Thomas Proud in the Lady Chapel further to the east. So this is a very important extra addition to the whole story. Well, I shouldn't go on much longer, but I can't resist showing this plan of Chichester Cathedral, which I made quite a few years ago now, and was published in, and Jill has, I see, updated it, but this was published in the official history of Chichester Cathedral we did a few years ago, because it's a very good parallel. Not least, you see, even at the crossing from the form of the piers here, now covered by the school building, it's quite clear that the choir of Reading Abbey was under a great crossing, probably a great tower on top. But Chichester, of course, it famously telescoped in 1869. So this is, of course, new Gilbert Scott work. But you see, the East End here, we have a very clear parallel, not least that these, when this part of the cathedral was underpinned in 1968, just about recorded, while enormous great concrete was being poured and things like that, found the bits of the apse, which had already been predicted by my hero, the great Professor Robert Willis, who found that the window was off-center here, and therefore it implied something was coming out here. But here, again, without going to you see what happens so commonly in the 13th century is they square off the East End and build a Lady Chapel in 2 stages. All of that is, of course, completely intact. And that all happened at the very beginning of the 13th century. In fact, ironically, the bishop who did this, who was only there for a short time, was the great famous Bishop Poore, who then moved quickly after the death of King John and so on to start Salisbury Cathedral before going to be Bishop of Durham. And he was the one who almost certainly started to square off the East End at Chichester. But it's just to give you a general parallel, and this is a much smaller church than Reading Abbey, I should say. And the nave will be far bigger, I'm sure, at Reading. Now, just to get down to the nitty-gritty, which I'm always asked, is, what do we know about the tomb? Famously, I'm sure many people know this, here is King John in Worcester Cathedral in its lovely Victorian tiled floor. And if you look at it, this amazing effigy on top is actually sitting on top of what is called a tomb. And a tomb at this time, and this was built at the beginning of the reign of Henry VIII, of course, because it was an elevating of the effigy, and we'll see the section in a minute, at the time of the building of this fabulous new chantry from the man who should have been king, King Arthur, rather than King Henry VIII, who of course has a chantry and is buried in a burial vault, which you had in the later 15th, early 16th century, under his chantry, just to the south of the high altar. So obviously when you've done that, you've got to make this rather less prominent a thing more prominent for the great King John. So what you actually, oh yes, and I can't resist showing you, here's a detail with his head with St. Wulstan and Oswald, the two wonderfully carved bishops whose shrines were here. That's why he wanted to be buried, you see, here. But look closely, because this is another wonderful coincidence. This is a magnificent slab of Purbeck marble. Here's the Unio Bed. This is full of wonderful bivalves, freshwater snails, and all sorts of things. And note the brown colour, which is caused by the iron. And if I then go to this I photographed just last year when I was helping Trev Haysom in the Isle of Purbeck get out new Purbeck marble. And what you find there is it breaks naturally in the bed like this, you see. So if anybody wants any of this, Trev has now got an enormous stack of new Purbeck marble, the grey, the green, and so on. So if people say you can't get decent Purbeck marble to restore buildings, rubbish. It's all there in the yard. But you see the iron, which is on the joints from the water penetrating through. So they didn't get quite a perfect, probably they should have got something more like this for carving King John's effigy. They just took a block, you see, and they still left the brown colour. I'm sure it was painted, so it didn't matter at all. So that is what it is. And this, and I'm afraid I didn't photograph the book very well, this is an extraordinary 1797 account. I'm sure many people will know. The key thing is this drawing, because this is the only time, as far as I know it, they dismantled John's tomb, and this is what was inside. Incredibly, John was completely intact. What it's like now, after, however many years since 1797, I don't know, and I don't know, but I may be wrong of anybody who's owned it since. And so here is the early 16th century new tomb chest, but you see inside, and this must be Purbeck marble too, is the original early tomb chest, which has that lid on. So this, the effigy of King John must be very soon after his death in 1216. Extraordinary discovery. Oh yes, I forgot to mention, sorry, it's slightly early. This is the western section drawn by Cecil Slade of that trench we just saw with the wall above it here to the Roman Catholic side. And this shows all the levels from the 12th century floors to the tile pavements intact, running up to the wall. If that's the case, and the wall hasn't been hacked down through it, there ought to be about 10 or so feet west of here, because that's the north aisle, a great stone coffin of Henry I. I really put my my guess on, out loud, because that is what should survive. And that site, now not under the car park, but immediately in the open ground, as it happens just to the east of the 19th century school, is the place where a really careful, proper research excavation, rather than keyhole archaeology or anything else. And I have to say, I still think what happened at Leicester was wonderful, and they've done a fantastic job, but they were just lucky in finding him, and he wasn't meant to be there. This abbey was built for Henry I with all his hundreds of millions in modern terms. So I think, with a bit of luck, I may be dead by then, an excavation there should find, maybe it's broken up, the remains of Henry's coffin at the very least, great square coffin. There's still one like this in Caen, with where William the Conqueror was buried, though the whole body was mangled up after the French Revolution and so on. It should be there, and there may even be broken up fragments of a wonderful Purbeck Marble effigy. I should have said there is documentary evidence that the effigy was restored in Richard II's time in 1398, I think it was, just before, of course, he was toppled. And the abbey was told they wouldn't get money from the king until it had been restored. So we know there's an effigy there. So the potential is vast. This is an aside, because the one thing I do get asked, and I did see this a long time when they were, this was a very hurried rescue excavation you see done in the bad old days in 1965. Faversham Abbey, totally robbed out to the foundations, but recorded by Brian Philp and the Kent unit when it was going to be built on. Luckily, this is still virgin ground. And the interesting thing here is he said these are the royal vaults for Stephen and his queen, of course, which is the next stage, and it copies very directly Reading Abbey. But unfortunately, his church didn't do very well, and you can see it was shortened. Here are the apsidal transept apses here were squared off in the 13th century, but here they obviously abandoned the east end. You can see burials then going across it later on, and the only areas excavated were where the trenches are, but it's only foundations. But these two oddities here may be the site of the original king and queen's tombs in front of the high altar here, though it's a different apsidal east end, and then getting shifted back, because this is a deep hole cut down into the ground, both of them completely empty, which could be the later medieval redug vaults for Stephen and his queen there. So that's the only real parallel we have. And oh dear, something's gone wrong with this drawing. But anyway, this is just the completed drawing and the end of my probably rather overlong diatribe of what we tried to do, but which now needs to be done digitally to show roughly what one does know about this amazing precinct. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. It was quite a journey through the archives.
It's a bit of a rapid one.
Yeah, well, I think it came in. We have some time for questions. The one comment I like most of you suggesting that the University of Reading should actually be dated to the dissolution of the monastery, which makes us only the third oldest university in England. But I'm sure others will
Absolutely
argue
right.
it.
Yes.
But I think it is over to you. What are the things you want to know or want to tell Tim? Because you know where Henry really is. I see a hand there. Just can you hold on?
There's a mic coming down. I'm afraid I am totally deaf in my right ear and rather deaf here, so I could repeat if I heard your question.
Thank you. Thank you for a great talk. Was squaring off the chapels that you mentioned simply a fashion, or was there a technical reason for doing that?
Well, yes, it was a fashion, but it was the way that Gothic architecture developed. And you'll find it all over the place. Apsidal endings to great Romanesque buildings were usually replaced by squared ends if they had the money. You know, if you find that the apses still survive, which of course they do, it usually means they haven't got the money to rebuild the east end of the building and put up a fancy lady chapel and so on. So it's pretty common, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. What was the purpose of a lady chapel? Did it have a specific purpose?
Absolutely. It became very rapidly in the later Middle Ages the most important chapel, because basically it was where the Lady Mass had to take place. A famous example of that being a bit strange is that in Salisbury Cathedral, dedicated to the Virgin, you couldn't have a lady chapel because the high altar was dedicated to Our Lady. So the Eastern Chapel is the Trinity Chapel, but it's where the Lady Mass took place, the famous Lady Mass that developed with singing boys, the choir in the late Middle Ages, and it was from the Lady Chapel choir that the Anglican choir of the post-Reformation period, right up to today, that's where they evolved. So the Lady Chapel was by far the most important part of the building. It was the cult of the Virgin. It's a key place.
One right up at the top. Thank you. I've got two, if that's all right. The first one is probably something everybody else knows, but I don't. So you said towards the end there was an Englefield excavation of the tomb of Henry I, or that area. I'm just wondering if you can tell us what's there now in that place where you believe the tomb is.
Where who believes?
You said there was an Englefield. Yeah.
Drawn, very useful 18th century plan of the ruins in the 18th century, which also shows the Civil War defences, which records things that were then destroyed subsequent to the building of the large prison. And so that's a key plan. So I probably muddled you. That plan shows some walls which have subsequently been obliterated, particularly the Lady Chapel. And the Lady Chapel, in its final form at Reading Abbey, is documented to the beginning of the 14th century, 1314, but there was probably an earlier 13th century Lady Chapel, and so on, as I showed at Chichester. So those are the key features, but as well as we know, because all the way through to 1532, when the Herald's report just before the dissolution is that Henry I remained in front of the high altar, as King John does to this day in Worcester Cathedral.
So do you believe that is somewhere in the prison grounds currently?
I think it's under the wall.
Under the wall.
And the nursery courtyard. I've never been on the other side of the wall, obviously, and so that's why I say it's probably not in a car park, but it's just to the west.
Okay.
Or even slightly underneath that boundary wall between the prison officers' car park, or what was, and the Roman Catholic land that's
Brilliant.
The courtyard outside the school.
That's what I was really curious about. Thank you very much. And the other question, which is completely different, is relating to the Holy Brook. I always believed it was there to drive the wheel of the Reading Abbey mill, but you said you believe that it was almost definitely there to wash out the lower daughter, which didn't mean anything to me. Could you the rear daughter? Could you?
Yeah, no. I think it started. There are many other examples of that. It started as a man-made canal channel to bring water from a higher level. It's still there. There are not many of these that do survive intact. They do in Caen to a certain extent in Normandy, to bring off water from the Kennet at a higher level to the west. I like going over it when I'm coming in on the train to Reading West. You pass over it. And then it was certainly there to flush out what is euphemistically called the rear daughter. In the 12th century, it's often called the necessarium. We all debate about whether you should call it a toilet now or a WC, or all these things. The key thing is that and this is what is forgotten about, is the rule of St. Benedict implies, because it has to be a bit careful with its language, that the monks had a very short time between getting out of their beds in the dormitory and before they had to appear in the choir for the first service. And therefore, if you've got 100 monks, which is certainly more than 100 probably were they planned for, and you saw how big it got at Lewes Priory, all those 100 monks had to go to the loo at the same time, to put it in crude modern technology. They couldn't queue up, you know, like boys in horrible public schools where you have to queue up in the loos and so on. So that was a requirement from day one. The biggest I know is at Canterbury Cathedral Priory, where there were 150 monks, and the first great rear daughter there is for that number. They shortened it later on when the numbers of monks dropped in the later Middle Ages. So, but they had to have a state-of-the-art flushing system. You know, they weren't cesspits or anything horrible, which everybody else had. And so you diverted water from the river to go underneath. And you'll find many examples at Bury St Edmunds, another huge abbey. The Lark has a stream coming off it that then goes through the rear daughter, and so on and so forth. In the later Middle Ages, and the same, by the way, happened at Westminster Abbey. I can't resist saying that the place where the water comes off for Westminster Abbey's rear daughter from the Tyburn, the infamous river, is under the corner of Buckingham Palace in the Equerry's Court, and it's still there. It's still a brick underground drain running through there, which part of the modern sewer system. But I'm probably not supposed to say that because that's a bit of a security problem.
Oops. Thank you very much.
So but in the later Middle Ages, they were often used, the water was increased, as happened at Westminster and so on, and you could therefore put water mills driving the wheel, you see, and Reading had many mills, as we know, on that, and that's why it's so sad that that mill was still going up to the 1950s. And I remember talking to John Kenneth Major, some people will know, I'm sure he's long dead now, but who was the great mills person here, about that mill, which then got obliterated apart from, well, one wall looks nice and medieval, so we'll keep that as a stupid arch over the Holy Brook. But so, yeah, that's a secondary use as a mill. Can you shout?
No, they'll bring you the
Oh,
microphone.
you probably need, I mustn't say that, sorry. Yeah.
Let's have the microphone.
Sorry.
No, it's hard work running up and down that step.
Thank you. Yeah, I was lucky enough to be working at the Inside at Reading Jail exhibition when the molar excavation started, and used to sneak out at lunchtime and take photos, and I've got quite an interesting selection of photos of some of those excavation pits. But that's actually by the by. The Abbey, Reading does tend to exaggerate itself in many ways. And in terms of the size and importance and wealth of the Abbey, Reading tends to put itself rather up the scale, nearer to the top. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are as to the importance of Reading Abbey in terms of abbeys in this country and Western Europe, let's say at its zenith, whenever that was.
Basically, it evolved over time. When Henry I built it, he wanted a state-of-the-art building that was as important as the greatest monastery in Western Europe at that time, i.e. Cluny. And they were the most up-to-date. They'd done much better than the Benedictines, who were getting a bit slack and all the rest of it. So he said, I want that to be the case. Now, as the king, he could do it. He then endowed it, and if you read Brian Kemp's wonderful works, you'll see this amazing number of places all over the country that gave them an income. And so at the beginning, it was state-of-the-art, also getting them from Lewis. The ironic thing was that when he started it, after 2 years, he said, it's not going to be part of the Cluniac business, because that means they'll be run from Cluny. It's a royal abbey now. So it was founded as a Cluniac house, but it then became, and by the later Middle Ages, it was just a royal abbey. The real thing is what then happens in the later Middle Ages. And at the end, there are plenty of statistics you can look at from, you know, the Valor Ecclesiasticus and all the rest of it, which tell you what their income from all their property was worth, and you can list them. And Reading, yeah, has shifted down a bit the list. But again, it depends on the abbey And being a royal abbey, and this is quite slightly amazing that Henry VIII, well, first of all, obviously he fell out with the abbot who he was going to have slaughtered, which didn't help, which was horrendous. But he, you would have thought, might respect Henry I, as he was also Henry and he was one of his predecessors, but we have no record of that. He just threw a tantrum, presumably, and poor old Cromwell did what was required, and so there is no record of that. But in terms of status, when it was built, it certainly was one of the greatest abbeys in England, in Britain in a way, in terms of its size. Anything over 100 monks are in a sort of top 10 or half a dozen or so great monasteries founded in the Anglo-Norman period. But it's the later Middle Ages, you know, it does sort of go downhill. Most of them lost about 50% of their monks in the Black Death. I mean, if we think it's bad now, you can imagine what happened in Reading when not only half the monks, and we don't have the statistics here, at Westminster we know exactly how many monks died, and the abbot, it drops to by 50%. It's never built up to that level again, and that is the same, no doubt, with the whole city. 50% die. Even my grandfather died in 1919 of Spanish flu. Hundreds of millions of people over the world did that. In a way, there are all these things. So whether you can say, oh, Reading is being overblowing itself about, you know, it was one of the greatest abbeys in England, isn't really relevant in the sense that it was when it was built. It was the state art, as you saw at Faversham, potty little town, even today, I could say that as a man of Kent, never got going properly, and they had to shorten the abbey straight away. Reading certainly didn't have that, and the only thing I didn't mention, there's one larger apse on the south transept, and I think almost certainly that from day one, it's part of the original church, is where this amazing relic, the hand of St. James, which, you know, there is now the modern one. Whether it does go back or not, I don't think anybody's done the work on it yet, but it's a particularly important enlarged apsidal chapel, and that's another part of the story, but we don't have the statistics. Pilgrims coming to see the hand of St. James, the most important relic in Reading Abbey, just like, you know, of course, in Canterbury Cathedral, they hit the jackpot instantly in 1170 when poor old Becket got zapped, to put it crudely, but everybody had other incomes as well as that. But pilgrimage was never important, but it's nice to see, you see the classic shells here and right under me, because that's all part of Santiago de Compostela, you know, which is the greatest shrine of St. James. But Reading, you know, was trying to jump on that bandwagon too, in having people come as pilgrims and giving them income.
This is just a follow-on question from about the Holy Brook. Was it used as a source of water for the abbey?
No, the pure water, as I said briefly, would have been in a lead pipe from up the top of the hill. They all, by the 20th century, all great abbeys had water through a lead pipe coming from a proper spring as a conduit. It was obviously used for other purposes, and I think you'll find there may be other channels coming off it and all the rest of it, but it was only the foul sewer, you see, as far as the abbey was concerned. There will certainly be a big pipe from the great kitchen, which must be just to the west, because we know that elsewhere. So all the food waste and the rubbish, just as people do until very recently, is chucked into that, which then goes into the Holy Brook and comes out in the Kennet, or came out in the Kennet. But no, they had really good pure water in a lead pipe.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Tim, we know that a number of stones, including a number of what we think are the cloister capitals, were found up at Borough Marsh, I think in the 1940s. Has that been exhaustively sort of excavated? Are we convinced there's nothing still there? Is there more to find?
I'm sure there is. Well, that's an amazing saga, because one of my great heroes is George Janetsky, long dead now, you know, the deputy director of the Court Institute under the infamous Blunt. wonderful Polish emigre. It's the only time art historians from the Courthold in the 50s, I think it was, came and did a dig. But it was a treasure hunt because they knew that all these lovely stones had been used for, I can't remember the details, but anyway, some sort of barrier to stop the Thames flooding. And so they dug them out, and there's lovely pictures of that. That is yet another of many sites where you could go on hunting for architectural fragments. But I mean, obviously it's a wonderful collection, and there are many others. Some are still in the arches in the Forbury Gardens and all the rest of it. But that's yet another side of the story, because as the museum has so beautifully done, you can reconstruct the original arcades of the middle of the 12th century using those. What we don't know until we've done more excavation on the cloister arcades is whether, in fact, they rebuilt the arcades in the later Middle Ages. I think it's likely, at least in one of the cloister works, they did, as happened at Canterbury. So that, in fact, what comes from Borough Marsh and elsewhere is a second recycling. In Canterbury, we have lots of lovely Purbeck Marble 12th century bits of arcades rebuilt into the 14th century rebuilt cloister when they put great vaults in and so on. So it's a secondary thing there, but at least it gives you an idea, you know, with the money to do that in the 12th century, and hence what the museum can show does give you a really good impression of what the original cloister was.
Okay, I think we've got one more question up there, and then I want to ask you a final question. So we'll just put one more up there.
Sorry, who was it?
Can you see? He's had his hand up for quite a while.
Hello, I'm John Painter from the Friends of Reading Abbey, and can I thank you very much for a very interesting talk, and also for the references to both Cecil Slade and to Brian Kemp and their seminal work over the years in developing the study of Reading Abbey, and I'm very pleased that the university is continuing that work into the future. That's very good news. I've got one comment and one question. The comment is about the burial or the tomb of Henry I, and I'm very pleased to hear what you've said, because it coincides with what I think is the case. He certainly wasn't buried under the car park. He could well have been buried under the backyard of what is now the nursery school, or possibly even under the nursery school. I have been into the backyard of the nursery school, and there are lots of utility trenches there. So if there was anything there, it may already have been discovered. But if the university is doing archaeological studies, then they possibly could talk to the Catholic Church about the documentation relating to 20th century works at the school.
Very good point.
So that's the comment. The question is about the water supply and the conduit. Clearly, the water supply. I mean, I've seen references to the water supply coming from where you say, from Whitley Street, although I don't quite know where those references are. But I'm intrigued about how a lead pipe goes down a hill and then crosses the river to come up the other side. Bearing in mind that the river in those days would have split into 6 or 7 different water courses. So it's a logistical matter of interest how the water supply got to the Abbey.
Absolutely, that needs finding out. They could have easily done it, because it would probably have gone through on a bridge or something like that, because we don't know the exact course, whether it's east or west. If you want to see how to do it, you've only got to look at the famous, wonderful waterworks plan in Cambridge, in the great Psalter of the 12th century, showing how the water came to Canterbury Cathedral Priory. Amazing bird's eye view drawing. If you don't know it, you should look at it, showing how it goes down through the orchard and then the vineyard. It has settling tanks at various points, because obviously it's a lot of silt coming out. And then it has almost certainly inverse siphon bits, because, you know, this is a closed lead pipe, just like the Romans did, and certainly this was happening in many great monasteries in Western Europe as well as England by the 12th century. So it will have been very, very carefully done, and it ends up in a water tower, and the Canterbury one still survives, in a great lead tank, so that again the water can then get distributed to all the parts of the monastery. And Canterbury cathedral prior, amazingly, still had this up until the Second World War, and when the main water pipes were destroyed with bombs in the war, they had to use the original 12th century system, which was adapted in the 16th century.
So, like all monastic archaeologists, you spent a lot of time talking about the plumbing, latrine
Absolutely.
blocks. That's
I
what
like the basic
monastic
stuff.
archaeologists always come back to that. And obviously, you've talked about Henry I because there's a lot of interest around that. But you hinted a few times, Tim, that you think that there's still potential for research excavations, and there's still things that we want to know about Reading Abbey. So, what would be your priority? If somebody was going to do excavations at Reading, given what survives now, what do you think is the key research question for Reading Abbey?
Well, it seems to me, because of seeing what other people do and have done in medieval archaeology, which not much is going on, is you do have, I hardly dare mention his name, Gilbert, what he's been doing at Lyminge and so on, and that could be sort of training, but the key thing is there are so many different aspects. For example, ground penetrating radar in the Forbury Gardens without doing any digging at all, so it's not going to cause any hurt. No doubt it will have to be done in the winter when the floodbeds are free or whatever, on the one hand, but also more detailed recording. My old friend Stuart Harrison was paid very small sums of money to do some recording work during the conservation. That needs developing so the elevations of all the surviving bits could be done as 3D stuff with a tower or whatever. But the key area, because everybody says because of what happened in Leicester, is where was Henry I and could we, get millions of tourists coming to see it, which I think you probably could. But to me, it needs to be done with the Roman Catholic Church, obviously, who own that site. It would need quite a lot of money because it must be done as an area excavation. It would need the demolition of the 1970 wall boundary between the two and an area excavation of where Cecil Slade did his work and a bit beyond it to clean it up really carefully and accurately, as Mike Fulford has done with St John Hope's excavations at Silchester, and to do it as a really careful excavation, but under the public eye, not secret excavations for commercial reasons, and that would then bring people in, to see what was going on. I mean, I'm sure a lot of damage will have happened, as you were saying, with the pipes for the school, but hopefully they're still above. I'm sure there are a lot of large areas of tile paving, glazed tile paving and all the rest of it. And it should be done as with Mike's excavation at Silchester in the summer, where people can actually see it as a new research program. It's not commercial archaeology. And I have a low opinion, as you saw, of some commercial.
We're going to have to edit these things out, you know that, don't you? Before your lecture
well, that's why I know. I can say,
mentioning the security at the palace, all those things have got to be edited out before this can go
I'm told
on
that
the web.
the report on the prison stuff is in the public domain now, so I didn't reveal any secrets by showing you slides of the report. But yeah, no, I think there's so much, and also you see, dare I say it, the best example of doing this in recent years has been going on in Exeter and Canterbury to a certain extent, and John Allen, the cathedral archaeologist, has been doing amazing work on the buildings, but they're redoing the cloister, and they've just been excavating there, they're recording the masonry, and they have done very good work on the 17th century defences and what's left of it when Exeter was besieged, so you can do post-medieval art and so on. It's huge potential.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much for that. You've shown us what detective work is required to bring together archaeological evidence from the archives from 18th century, some earlier plans onwards, and the important excavations of the 20th century. You've kind of identified the potential for non-destructive work, not necessarily excavations, but geophysics and so on. And you've done a fantastic job drawing all of this together and drawing on your lifetime of research, not just on Reading, but on a variety of comparative sites to show us the comparisons with St. Augustine's Canterbury, for example, and we're just delighted that you've been able to share this with us, and we're very proud that this has been the first public lecture and one to commemorate the 900th anniversary of the foundation of Reading Abbey. So many thanks.
And also Brian Kemp
and in honour
Cecil Slade, who
of Brian
really
Kemp.
should now be remembered, particularly
Yes.
Cecil Slade, because he's been dead a few years now. He did some amazing work on behalf of this university.
And you've done an excellent job in commemorating them and their work. And I know that many people in the audience today are delighted with that, and with the light that you've shone on the Abbey. So if you could all join me in thanking Tim for an excellent lecture.